Hey, welcome to our weekly Facebook Live. Today it's usually on Thursdays, but today we're doing it on Friday to see how it goes. I'm Melinda Sampson, the Community Outreach Coordinator for NC Stop Human Trafficking. So thank you so much for being here today. And today, what we're going to talk about is how racism and misogyny affect women of Asian Pacific Islander descent. In the aftermath of the murder of 7 women and 1 man at massage parlors and spas in Georgia, a spotlight has really shone on the nature of exploitation and the violence perpetrated against women of Asian Pacific Islander descent. There has been reticence by law enforcement to say this massacre was a hate crime, uh, but to be abundantly clear, the murder of these people at Asian massage parlors or spas in 2 different cities is a hate crime against people of Asian Pacific Islander descent. The nature of the crime was racialized and gender-based violence. The shooter said he murdered these women because he was a sex addict and they were the problem. So the motive is multi-layered and reflects what the nature of exploitation and objectification of Asian Pacific Islander women can look like specifically, and misogyny as a whole. But we want to first ask ourselves these questions, like, why are women of Asian Pacific Islander descent fetishized and seen as disposable to such an extent that an entire commercial sex sector, illicit massage businesses, is a leading industry in sex and labor trafficking in the United States? And the second question we got to ask is, why was it that this man thought it was acceptable to perpetrate the ultimate violence against these women instead of holding himself accountable for his own sexual issues? And that's where misogyny comes in. We're going to be talking first about the racialized gender-based violence, and then next week we'll be going into the misogynistic aspect of this. But it's also really important to note that there was no definitive proof that all the victims of the shooting were involved in the commercial sex trade, which highlights the great assumption by media and law enforcement that they all were. So we're going to unpack why that assumption even exists, as well as the prevalence of exploitation among women of API descent or Asian Pacific Islander descent. So let's start at the beginning with the history, right? The history of Asian Pacific Islander immigration policies in the United States has been fraught and is part of the beginning of the dehumanization and the sexualization of API women. Let's put this in context. In 1882, the U.S. enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act that prohibited Chinese women from immigrating to the United States for immoral purposes, which built on an already established and false narrative in the United States. So this narrative was already here, that most Chinese women were predominantly involved in prostitution. It's also important to note other racist policies that we've had here in the U.S. around people who are Asian or of Asian Pacific Islander descent. And that would be another policy were the Japanese internment camps from 1942 to 1945, after Pearl Harbor. Those internment camps isolated people of Japanese descent in the United States and stigmatized them. These policies are still kind of reverberating through American, Asian, Pacific Islander communities, and it would be misleading to not acknowledge this racist policy and other racist policies and not make those connections. And it would be misleading to not also recognize rhetoric and how that has in many ways fueled the dehumanization of whole populations of people in the United States, ultimately making violence, I'm making the connection now, ultimately making violence and exploitation against them more prevalent. When we dehumanize people, violence against them will invariably increase. Attacks against Asian Pacific Islander Americans have increased across the country due to discriminatory rhetoric that was spewed from the very top of American leadership around the origin of the novel coronavirus. Women of Asian or Pacific Islander descent endured a lot of the brunt of these discriminatory comments due to the inflammatory and misguided epithets such as Kung Flu and the China virus. The shootings in Georgia were in many ways a culmination of the violence against people of API descent. The history of exploitation of women of API descent also leads us to a history of racialized misogyny in the United States. Throughout history, women of Asian or Pacific Islander descent were seen by men in the U.S. as exotic and submissive, based on the falsely propagated narrative of the media, the leadership, and differing cultural norms. So what we're looking at now is people, mostly men, have fetishized Asian women to such an extent that Pornhub's annual 2019 report, it shows the term Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and Asian were among the top 20 search results for porn on that site. The racism of the pornography industry as well, and the pervasiveness of it, fuels the exploitation of Asian Pacific Islander women further. It also fuels the exploitation of Black women, indigenous women, and women of color as well. Frankly, racism and exploitation of women is a tale as old as the colonization of the United States to begin with. So now let's address the elephant in the room, and that's going to be illicit massage businesses. There are an estimated 9,000 illicit massage businesses open in the United States, according to Polaris. It's a $2.5 billion industry in the U.S. On a national scale, illicit massage businesses is an industry that comes in second behind escort services for the prevalence of sex trafficking. The illicit business is rife with exploitation to the most extreme degrees. So it's a form of sex trafficking, but it is also a form of labor trafficking when you look at the business model of illicit massage businesses. On a national level, illicit massage businesses are alarmingly prevalent. And North Carolina is not immune to this industry that is always kind of shifting and changing. Most victims of human trafficking who are found in IBMs or illicit massage businesses are women from China and South Korea, and some from Thailand and Vietnam, so of Asian Pacific Islander descent, between the ages of 35 and 55. So that's what we're kind of looking at there on that end. And so we really have to address why illicit massage businesses have become so lucrative and sprawling. And the short answer to that is demand, based on the history of dehumanizing policies and rhetoric around Asian Pacific Islander women in the United States. So again, racism fuels exploitation. Racism is a way populations become vulnerable, and we really need to look at it for what it is and for the truth of it. Fetishizing women of Asian Pacific Islander descent fuels the demand for sex trafficking of women in this population. So, as the demand increases and women of Asian Pacific Islander descent become more objectified, stigmatized, and ostracized, it comes as no surprise that there are 9,000 plus illicit massage businesses in the United States, with the majority of those women in those businesses of API descent. Those same women could likely be exploited for labor and sex enduring violence and living conditions on a devastating scale, and are deserving of a life that they had a voice in freely choosing. If some of these women are working in these illicit massage businesses by free choice, they should not be arrested. And later today, we'll be sharing a link about how a police investigation into an illicit massage business actually re-victimize the women that were working there. So I'll be putting that in our feed a little later today. So they should be treated as human beings. The continued dehumanization of people involved in commercial sex is a human right issue all on its own. So they are worth so much more than what the spokesperson for the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office in Georgia said. I think his name is Captain Jay Baker, when he dismissed the murder of 8 people, as the murderer was pretty much fed up and kind of at the end of his rope, and yesterday was really a bad day for him, and this is what he did. So the captain explains it as, this is what he did. It was a bad day. He was a sex addict. He's acting out. We really need to highlight how racism, but also misogyny and the dehumanization of people who could possibly be involved in commercial sex led to that comment. Next week, we're going to unpack that a little more, misogyny a little more, around women of Asian Pacific Islander descent, but misogyny as a whole, and how that lends itself to not only comments made by the captain, but also how someone could justify shooting 7 women because of their own sexual issues. How a man can justify shooting 7 women based on his own sexual issues. But that's for next week. I just wanted to come in today and talk a little bit about what our blog was about this week, which is racism, specifically racism's role in the exploitation and violence against women of Asian Pacific Islander descent. And our newsletter is also about that. You can read our blog and our newsletter. The links are in the comment. Not in the comments. I'm sorry. The links in the description of this video. And if you have any questions, please ask them in the comments. I'll be following this video as I do every week, and I'll answer them as quickly as possible. So thanks so much for your time this afternoon, and check out our blog and our newsletter on this topic. It's part 1, so part 2 is next week. Thanks.